Christian Spirituality in the Catholic Tradition, Part 9. The two most outstanding nuns of this period are Saint Hildegard and Saint Elizabeth of Schonau. Both were Germans, both were in the Benedictine tradition, and both were highly esteemed mystics. Hildegard, born in 1098, became a Benedictine nun at the age of 18 and became abbess in 1136. She was always ill, and she declared that since the age of 3 she had had visions, and at the age of 40 she was commanded by an interior voice to record her visions. When she consulted Saint Bernard about the matter in 1141, he wisely told her to practice the virtues and not pay too much attention to visions and revelations. Hildegard died in 1179, and her revelations were approved by 3 popes and the Council of Treves. Her writings are a strange mixture of spiritual revelations, the scientific knowledge of her day, and the prophetic intuitions. She left a collection of 300 letters and a principal work entitled Scivias Domini. Always a humble woman in spite of the many calls upon her for advice and her many travels throughout Germany, Hildegard taught a prudent asceticism that enabled her monastery to prosper under her guidance. She provided a surprisingly exact account of her mystical experiences and taught that mystical contemplation is available to all who conquer their vices and allow themselves to be set afire by the Holy Spirit. A good disposition for contemplative prayer is spiritual reading and then meditating on what has been read. So much better than this is the divine office. Saint Elizabeth of Schonau, born in 1129, was also a visionary, but unlike Hildegard, all of her visions were ecstatic and accompanied by extraordinary phenomena and intense suffering. At the command of her confessor, she wrote down her experiences and also composed letters and prayers and books called The Ways of God. Her writings were widely read because she gave spiritual counsel to persons from all states of life. Some critics have theorized that The Ways of God is based to a large extent on the Scivias by Saint Hildegard, who was a close friend and correspondent. 2 other works attributed to Elizabeth are 3 volumes of visions, although some scholars accept only the first book of Elizabeth's original work, and a treatise on martyrdom of Saint Ursula and companions, which has generally been considered unreliable and the source of many unfounded legends. Neither Hildegard nor Elizabeth have been officially canonized. As regards the emergence of lay brothers, or conversi, in the monastic life, we should note that as early as the 4th century, Pope Siricius had written to the Bishop of Tarragona, "We desire that monks whom seriousness of conduct, holiness of life, and practice of faith commend, be admitted to the duties of the clergy." In 1311, Pope Clement V stated, "For the increase of divine worship, we prescribe that monks, at the notification of their abbots, must prepare themselves for all sacred orders, once legitimate excuses have been removed." Finally, Pope Clement VIII decreed, "Whoever is received into an order of regulars must possess such knowledge of letter or give an unquestioned hope of acquiring such knowledge that he may receive minor orders, and in due time the major orders as well, according to the degrees of the Sacred Council of Trent." The foregoing statements reflect a gradual transition in monastic life, which led not only to the ordination of monks into the priesthood, and consequently the ecclesiastical classification of monastic institutes as clerical right religious, but it also led to a new class of monks called lay brothers. A variety of causes led to this development. By the end of the 9th century, the Benedictine monks had devoted themselves almost exclusively to lectio divina and liturgical worship, to the detriment of manual labor. The intellectual incompetence and holiness of the monks make them eminently worthy of priestly ordination, while the diocesan clergy of the 9th to the 12th centuries were often ignorant and immoral. By the 11th century, the monasteries were sorely in need of hands to administer the external goods, do the work of the fields, and perform the domestic duties within the cloister. Numerous monasteries have made use of lay help as laborers and servants, but too often this had led to all kinds of difficulties. The solution was found in the institution of a special class of monks who were distinct from the choir monks. From various documents issued by monasteries of Benedictine life, and from statements made by several popes between the 12th and 16th centuries, we can describe the lay brothers, or conversi, as true religious who form an integral part of the monastic community and are dedicated to the manual labor and external services of a monastery, so that the choir monks can dedicate themselves to their particular duties. As their form of life became more clearly defined, the lay brothers pronounced only simple vows, wore a distinctive habit, prayed their own office, assisted at specified monastic exercises such as conventual mass, compline, chapter of faults, and solemn functions, made an annual retreat, received a weekly spiritual conference from their own master or director, and formed a kind of community within the general community of the monastery. Later, when new forms of religious life were approved by the church, provision was usually made for the admission of lay brothers as a distinct but integral part of the religious institute. To summarize, Benedictine spirituality in the 12th century still preserved the essential notes that were common to all monastic spirituality, with certain differences in regard to observances. It was, above all, a spirituality firmly rooted in biblical sources and nourished by lectio divina and liturgical prayer. The life of the Benedictine monk was a life of prayer and penance, a life withdrawn from the world by a desire to be united with God. As Leclerc describes it, it was a prophetic life, because it consisted in waiting for the coming of the Lord in prayer and penance. It was an apostolic life, because it was a life of community and love, after the example of the disciplines of the Cenacle and the first Christians. It was a life of martyrdom, because it involved separation from the world and a constant warfare against the obstacles to charity. It was an angelic life, because it sought total detachment through prayer, asceticism, and chastity. It was an evangelical life, because it sought to imitate Christ by walking the way to the gospel. Yet there were also new trends evident in the Benedictine spirituality of the 12th century, thanks to the Cistercian movement. First of all, there was a vigorous insistence on the place of manual labor in monastic life, and this, as we have seen, was not so much an innovation as a return to the original teachings of Saint Benedict. Secondly, there was an equally strong emphasis on the contemplative purpose of monastic life, with the result that the Cistercians explicitly regulated their lectio divina, prayer and ascetic practices, with a view to contemplation and union with God. It is in this second area that the Cistercians made their greatest contribution to spirituality, especially in the persons of Saint Bernard and William of St. Thierry, who bring us a step closer to a systematic theology of Christian perfection and a psychology of the mystical state.